Thanks for joining us at BIB Today, the daily podcast from the Newsroom of Business in Vancouver. I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief. You know, we might feel like we have a little bit of election fatigue in our country with so much repetition of who gets elected. But of course, there's been in Australia in the last little while an election that changed the government, set up probably some different priorities for the time ahead. Canada, though, remains a pretty important trade partner, and of course, British Columbia being the closest. In a little hop, step, and jump of about 18 or 19 hours to get there is of course the closest to it, and in a lot of cases the importance of its representation in our country is something that we don't pay enough attention to. I think our guest today is the country's representative of their country and ours, the High Commissioner Scott Ryan. He's no stranger to elected politics even. Having been in the Senate, having been in Parliament in Australia, and he was the youngest person ever elected into the Senate. I remember when I was one of the younger people doing things.
No, I can't claim that I wasn't the youngest. I think I might have been the youngest person who became president of the Senate. Yeah.
President.
There were younger people there than I.
All right. He's been in Canada since December, so you left your summer for our winter, and now you get to experience our summer.
I did.
Winter.
Yes, we landed here just before Christmas, and my two young boys saw snow the first time when they walked out of Ottawa Airport.
Never seen snow?
Never seen snow.
Oh, well, that is a good experience.
That was nice. Canada put on a white Christmas for our first Christmas here.
Somewhat our pleasure. We don't always love the depth of the snow, but it is lovely. So welcome. What happens when there is a government change in terms of what happens inside the Foreign Service, and what kind of preparation do you have to make? What kinds of briefings have to take place? What sort of books get arrayed in order to help the new government understand? So
essentially what happens across the government is all government departments will prepare briefing packs for the government being re-elected or an opposition being elected to office, and immediately after effectively the result is clear, those briefing packs will be provided by senior officials to deal with whoever the leader of the party who's going to be Prime Minister directs. In Australia this time it was particularly fast. We will often do a transition to government after an election over the course of a week, maybe two if it's a very close result. But on this occasion, because of the meeting of the Quad in Tokyo with the leaders of Australia, Japan, India and the United States, it was always going to be quick if there was a transition. So the outgoing government conceded on the Saturday night. The incoming government made a speech outlining his priorities, reflecting the election result. He and several ministers were sworn in on Monday, and I think it was less than 4 hours later they were on a plane to Tokyo, the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister, to attend the security dialogue.
I will say that was one of the fastest appearances internationally of any leader I've ever seen.
It was fast, even by Australian standards, but it was foreseen because that date for that conference had been set months ahead.
Yeah. When I don't want you to necessarily divulge every last thing that you're going to send back home and all of this, but do you get to inject a little bit of your own impressions of the country, a little bit of your own impressions of the political climate here in the advice that you're giving?
One of the roles, as well as being representative of the Australian government here, is to provide feedback on developments here and what's going on here. So right across our Foreign Service and right across the footprint we have overseas, because it also exists in other departments of the Commonwealth, of the federal government, that advice is sought and provided back.
Yeah, and you've only been here for 5-6 months, but what do you think of this place?
Look, it's a fantastic opportunity. These roles are a real privilege, firstly, to be able to represent your country. I knew a bit about Canada. My academic background when I was a student involved a bit of a study of Canadian constitutional arrangements and intergovernmental arrangements. And there are so many apparent similarities between our countries despite the distance. We are large countries, we are federations, we have different levels of government. We have traditional cooperation in security spheres, we have the Commonwealth tradition, we have been when I go to World War I memorials, and I did one in the Somme a few years ago, I went to the Canadian memorial as part of my journey to the Australian and New Zealand memorials on Anzac Day. So the links go back quite a long way. It is one of Australia's oldest diplomatic posts. We opened up here in 1940. Canada opened up in Australia, I think I was told, before we even federated as a nation in 1900 with the first Trade Commissioner's Office. I think it was in Sydney in the 1890s. So those links go back a long way. A couple of things I think when you come to Canada that you don't necessarily pick up until you come here. Australians aren't often used to coming somewhere bigger. We are a large country spread out. You are a larger country, and I did a check on Google Maps. You're essentially almost 1,200 kilometres wider than Australia.
Yeah, we're big.
It's a very big country. So that's one thing.
But we don't have this profound outback.
You have a north. You have a north. I think there's a bit more regional variation across Canada, partly distance, partly cultural, partly historic. So getting out of Ottawa and understanding the differences between the provinces and the cities. You're a slightly more decentralised population. We have more people, say, in our top 5 cities. And then, of course, there's the obvious Australian observation is you have a very tough climate.
Yeah, we have a tough climate. And we're in the backyard of the superpower, and that affects us. And you have your own issues with another emerging superpower in China. Where are the similarities, do you think, in terms of our if you want to call them concerns or our challenges with China and yours?
Well, I'll speak to Australia. I don't necessarily think I try and avoid speaking on behalf of other countries, but our Prime Minister, a new Prime Minister, and our Foreign Minister have made observations both before and after the election that the challenges we have in our relationship are because China has changed, not because Australia has changed. They have been exhibited in disagreements over important and fundamental international norms like the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and the view from Australia that some of the trade sanctions applied to some of our goods are inappropriate and they should be reconsidered as a way, if the relationship is to particularly improve. It is a significant trading partner for Australia. There are significant links in terms of people, but there has been a change in the forward-leaning nature of the government of China over the last few years, which has placed the relationship under stress.
Yeah. One of the challenges that we grapple with here is the question of ownership and the question of investment in our country, and we seem to want it two different ways. We rather like the investment because it generates prosperity. We don't tend to like the ownership too much because it then has a sense of either dominance or presence that takes away a little bit of the agency, of the sovereignty of the country. Where is Australia sat on this?
Well, we've had a long-standing foreign investment review board process that's overseen by the Treasurer of Australia, where decisions can be taken in the national interest, and it is a decision that the Treasurer can take. Underpinning that is a series of advice that goes to the Treasurer, and part of that now incorporates national security advice. It's non-country specific. It looks at Australia's national interests and where there are sensitive sectors, and then decisions are made and announced. And obviously some sectors are more sensitive than others, but we make it effectively about the sector, the economy and Australia's national interest. It's not country specific in that sense. Yeah.
When you take a look at the kind of relationship that, say, British Columbia has with Australia, I mean, you're here in summer, and we're starting to get actually the influx of some workers here from Australia who come here for the summer, and some of them actually want to stay, but many of them just go home after this. Where are the big areas of trade and relationships between a province like British Columbia and the country?
So let's talk about the post-COVID world here, or not the post-COVID world, the new COVID world, the with-COVID world. Because obviously those people-to-people links that consisted of a few thousand students a year exchanging, the working holidays where you would see younger Canadians primarily come to Australia and vice versa, that all obviously was limited during the era of travel restrictions. What I can say is that since the direct flights started late the year, I think it was a few days before I came, I understand travel bookings are quite strong. And in fact, I couldn't get on the first flight that we wanted to actually come to Canada. Bookings were so strong. So I think those
Doesn't
people...
diplomatic community give you, flight privileges?
No, not at all. You just got to jump on the plane like everyone else. But to me, it was a positive sign that I think both our countries have a lot of pent-up demand, particularly amongst those who would have travelled and were going through that stage of life where they'll have the working holiday experience, the travel experience. Definitely in Australia, there's pent-up demand about that, and there is lots of travel being undertaken, and we're trying to encourage some of that domestically as well, because like yourselves, we did have a domestic tourism industry that was hit quite hard. So I think that will start to increase. I've been speaking to universities, and they're re-engaging their exchange and travel footprint as well. One of the things that strikes me is, British Columbia, and when I've been here over the last few days, people talk to me about how occasionally they feel distant from the centre or the east of the country. It is a different economy. And one of the familiarities is that more Australians come here, both for work and tourism. It does seem like a long way when you're on the 16-hour flight, but it is also a lot closer than the other part, than the east of the country. So I think those people-to-people links will increase. I think the university links and the student links will establish a new normal, but there does appear to be a demand there. And then you have those businesses that will use Vancouver or British Columbia as a stepping stone into the Canadian market, or even, as I'm increasingly learning, sort of the northwestern American market.
Yeah. We have the benefit here in British Columbia and really across the country of a trade link that is a drive away to really the world's biggest manufacturer, and and of course the home of the most voracious consumers anywhere. And yet, of course, during the pandemic and preceding the pandemic, even you could start to see some supply chain issues emerge. They were exacerbated considerably by the pandemic. What's the experience again in Australia around the importation of goods, around export, around manufacturing, and how that has, in a lot of ways, disrupted, kind of traditional, well-flowing economies?
So we have a slightly different economy. We're at the end of the line in many ways. We're not as integrated in a single economy, and again, I think it's one thing that people from outside Canada, it sort of strikes you when you speak to businesses here, universities, businesses of all types, the degree of economic integration over the border in terms of particularly manufacturing, but it doesn't have to be things like auto manufacturing, it's food manufacturing, it's a whole range of things. That the nature of that economy is something that is unique, I think, to this relationship between the United States and Canada. We had similar challenges around, sovereign capacity to produce at the early outset things like face masks and things like PPE that we all needed, because we are a country that has reduced trade barriers over the last 30 to 40 years, and so some of those elements of local manufacturing capacity had gone by the by, and so governments have now looked at what do we need to produce here. Yeah. We were fortunate enough to have the old Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, CSL, which is a vaccine manufacturer and now a major, one of the world's largest blood products companies.
As you know, that was one of our real deficiencies.
And we historically had that because we were a long way from anywhere. And so that was privatised, I think, would be 30 years ago now, about 1992, and it's become a global leader. But we had that domestic capacity to manufacture the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. And like Canada now, the governments are putting in money and putting up capital to sustain or to develop a domestic mRNA manufacturing capacity, because that does appear to be the way of so many future medical opportunities, not just with vaccines, but with therapeutics. So we face similar challenges. And in some ways, we were more isolated, and our governments got very nimble, very expert at trying to source the products we needed in a very competitive world.
Are there relatively conclusive learnings, you think, out of the pandemic in terms of what the roles of government, roles of private sector ought to be in preparing for what will doubtless be another pandemic someday?
I think that's I think there undoubtedly are, and there undoubtedly will be more, because it's a work in progress. I mean, I made the mistake earlier of talking about post-COVID. It's not post-COVID, it's with COVID, the world. So what do we learn from that? And we still don't know what challenges will emerge. But at all times, our ability to predict epidemiologically the risk of, what new variants might be, our ability to respond to them, our ability to fine-tune our health system. If this had happened, imagine only 15 years ago, the capacity for people to even work from home would be different. I mean, technology was at a point where we could all make a shift, or many of us, not all of us, to remote working. There was a period of remote schooling that was very difficult for many. I mean, I had remote schooling children as well. But imagine doing it in the days before video conferencing was available. It's quite extraordinary how difficult and different the world would have been.
We have, we've gone here from 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week for people coming in, to having a lot of people living in other parts of the country working for us. Same thing there?
It seems to be a different experience across the Australian cities. I know it's different in Canada. Different cities and different provinces had different COVID experiences, and that's very true of Australia. So my old hometown, Melbourne, was probably hit the hardest and longest, but Sydney was also hit pretty hard. Perth in Western Australia was able to close its border and effectively maintained an environment that it was protected from COVID, and it reopened earlier this year with a high vaccination rate and the Omicron wave that has caused it serious problems, but it didn't have anywhere near the period of remote schooling. So to be honest, I actually had to relocate from my home city of Melbourne to Canberra because of my last job on a day's notice, with the family in the car, with the cat in the back and the bikes on the roof, and relocated to Canberra. And so
I'm not saying you had empathy for Novak Djokovic, but obviously he had to relocate as well. The whole other thing.
Australia, like here, we had a very strong public support for vaccination.
Yeah.
And so we have, I think, a slightly higher rate of vaccination than here, but it's in the 90s, I think, of the double dose, and a bit behind that on the third dose. I haven't checked the figures lately. And so there was strong public support for people coming into the country saying, well, we've done it, so should you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can see now, even in Canada, where we have baseball season, and Americans aren't allowed to come up and play if they haven't been vaccinated.
I did not realise that.
Teams are arriving in Toronto minus 2 or 3 or 4 players at sometimes.
I hadn't caught up with that.
We're still being pretty sticky about it. So you've now settled in, I presume, and you get to kind of map out priorities as a High Commissioner, and no question on what it is that which spots you're going to pick and which ones leave alone, in terms of talking to Canadian authorities about what progress can be made between the two countries. Are you beginning to identify what your identity is as a High Commissioner, and how that might translate? Yeah,
well, I think we've got to always be aware that most of our jobs in the public space, I think, are dealing with what the world throws at us in many ways. So when I came here in December, I don't think I would have predicted the illegal actions and invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which our officials have been talking a lot about. We're fully supportive of the stand that NATO and Canada has led in supporting Ukrainian resistance. So that is one of the classic events that you don't necessarily predict, but does take up a lot of your time. My predecessor and staff, I don't think they came to Canada thinking they would be dealing with COVID and the pandemic and the workload and the way of work that entailed. But I think, from my perspective, there are incredibly strong relations across our two countries that in many ways are also outside the Foreign Service. So our government departments across a whole range of policy areas have a great deal to do with one another. The government in Australia and the new Foreign Minister have pointed out that a couple of their key priorities, for which I think there is great opportunity for alignment with Canada, on raising ambition on dealing with climate change, which is particularly acute in our region, in the Pacific, of course, because of the unique vulnerability of those nations and peoples. And also, we both have the tragic legacy of Indigenous dispossession and racism, and all the consequences that have flowed from that. And as countries that were settler or colonised countries, we are both dealing with the legacy of that and trying to right that wrong and address that entrenched intergenerational disadvantage.
And your country is a little farther ahead in terms of a timeline. in the experience on this? I mean, for Canada, this is still feeling like a relatively recent emergence of a political movement in order to ensure that we get that form of reconciliation.
It's interesting you say that, because I think a lot of Australians who are who are very familiar with this space might say the same about Canada. I think we had different, the same tragedy and events and the same legacy of that. Different events happened, and we're dealing with different things at different speeds. So I would suggest there are some areas, I think, in Canada where they are a bit further ahead of Australia. It's interesting that you say that. But in essence, there is that common experience, and there are lots of learnings, I think, that can be applied from one to the other, just as our agencies were talking to each other, for example, during the initial stages of the pandemic and the unique risk to Indigenous communities that both countries presented.
Yeah. You would find in British Columbia that actually that isn't the national picture in a certain way. We are, I think, quite a bit ahead of where the rest of the country is. And I think that has set us up in a very good way, a very strong way for a kind of a nation-to-nation economic participation that really wasn't even discussed 10 or 15 years ago on any kind of considerable way. The rest of the country, I think, still kind of slow-poking.
It was one of the issues our Prime Minister spoke about when they spoke, and I think they spoke only 3 or 4 days after the change of government. It was one of the early conversations, and it reinforced what the Foreign Minister stated during the campaign, which is to develop and establish a First Nations diplomacy agenda. And that is something that there are unique opportunities for Australia and Canada to work with, both on shared experience, redressing disadvantage, and a lot of the detailed policy work that needs to be done to achieve that.
Yeah, you're talking about climate change. I remember interviewing a scholar from Tasmania, actually, around forest fires, forest management. And of course, we've had not only the grand heat dome here last summer, that was just extraordinary for our country, but we still seem to be contending with forest management in order to deal with it. You fly over British Columbia, you would see just how much there is, but how much has also been taken from us by fire and all of this. Is that one area we do send we send crews to each other when things go wrong, but what kind of participation, what sort of collaboration do you think is possible between the two countries around climate change?
So to go to the fires point, it is one of those areas where we wish we weren't as engaged with one another. But, I'm from Victoria, and I remember it was a semi-regular event that we would have Canadian firefighters come to relieve ours, after weeks of fighting terrible bushfires. And it is something that is deeply appreciated on both sides. No one can forget the sights and the photos of the red skies, the blood red skies of the Australian bushfires 2 years ago, which were not as fatal as what happened in my home state in 2009, when 180 people approximately died in a day with the most savage fires we'd seen. But they were much larger, much longer, and displaced so many more people. And in fact, hundreds of kilometres away, smoke alarms were going off in Canberra in buildings. So on climate change, the Australian government has raised its ambition that we've got a 43% commitment of reduction of emissions by 2030. What that will see is a substantial reduction, however, in our electricity generation. You have a lot of hydro here. On the other side of the country, there's hydro and nuclear. Our grid is older. It is primarily fossil fuel powered. We have record penetration of renewable energy, but to achieve that target, it has been outlined that we'll be looking at well over 50% of 60% of electricity generation will be renewable, and overwhelmingly that is wind and solar, not hydro.
Is there a substantial enough plan to get to that target?
The government will be investing particularly in re-engineering and supporting grid development. So one of the things about Australia that is profoundly different to Canada, not being next door to the world's largest economy, is that our electricity grid is about 5,000 kilometres long and thin, and not plugged into anywhere else. So moving power from where it can be generated, particularly with renewable sources, which are in very different parts of the country than the traditional coal-fired power plants, moving that power around is key. And so the government has announced some investments in order to ensure that the grid can be upgraded to make it more resilient and better at delivering that renewable energy. So that will be key to it. But the rooftop like there are more than 2 million Australian homes, I think it's over 2.5 now, with rooftop solar. It's the highest penetration of rooftop solar in the world. And it isn't just in the northern part of the country, it's right across Melbourne as well. We have a lot of sun.
Yeah, you do have a lot of sun. We often don't here in British Columbia, but we do have a lot of access to water.
Yep.
And water is just as important in all of this. Last question. We've talked about all kinds of serious things here, but how does an Australian have fun in Canada?
Well, I tried to learn sort of cross-country skiing over winter.
I thought you were going to say you're trying to pick up hockey, but okay.
No, I'm going to go to ice skating in a minute. That's harder. Okay. And of course, the lessons all got cancelled because of the lockdown that happened in Ontario and Quebec over January. But I got a few lessons in, and then the supply chain issues hit, and I couldn't buy skis to practice. Ice skating, I'm a bit more reticent about. I have been ice skating once in my life. It was my 13th birthday in Melbourne in 1986, and I broke my arm. So I'm a little bit more reticent about picking up the ice skating.
It's funny you would remember that.
Yeah, it's an amazing birthday present. My friends wrote really mean things on the plaster cast too the next day at school.
That's part of a Canadian tradition.
But no, so it's around Ottawa. Now it gets a bit warmer. We do day trips. You get out to see some amazing natural beauty. We've been down up to Quebec City. We've seen history. You've got great museums. I really enjoy cycling. So since the weather's got warm, I am hitting the cycling trails around Ottawa quite a lot. I haven't yet braved...
Going into the Gatineau.
Braved the Gatineau Hills. It's been a few months without the bike, so I just need to get conditioned back a bit.
Yeah. You do the Rideau Canal thing.
And I did the loop around the river and all that. I take my son out.
Flat.
And also... There's a lot of people to meet, and it's partly people coming back out again post-COVID. So Ottawa had, Ontario in particular, did have a very long period of shutdown, and then we had the January shutdown, and then the trucks in February. So there's a real appetite for people to meet one another. So it's a real opportunity to get out and meet more officials, more NGOs, more people in universities, more people in business.
Yeah.
It's a really pleasant place to spend some time.
Yeah, it's a great place to grow up for kids as well.
Yep.
Ottawa.
It does feel a bit like Canberra, and people say it is a bit like Canberra in that sense.
Yeah. Well, come back, try to get a skate on the Rideau Canal in before you come back. But next year.
It's on the to-do list, and I'll take some lessons.
The one thing about the Rideau Canal, you find, the wind blows in your face no matter which direction you're going. It's just what it is. Scott Ryan, good to see you. Thanks a lot for coming in today.
Look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.
I'm Kirk LaPointe, publisher and editor-in-chief of Business in Vancouver. Thanks for joining us.